Dr. Paul A. Cleveland is one of America's foremost authorities on the role of government in society and the issues which arise when it exceeds proper boundaries. Dr. Cleveland received his BA and MA from Auburn University and his PhD in economics from Texas A&M University. For the past 18 years, he's been a professor at Birmingham Southern College. He's the author of 2 books, including Understanding the Modern Culture Wars and numerous articles, essays. He has lectured at universities throughout the United States, Asia, Europe. He's married, has 2 children, is a member of the Covenant Presbyterian Church where he is a ruling elder. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Cleveland.
Wow, I don't know how I can live up to that. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'll try not to put you to sleep by speaking too slowly. I am from Alabama. It comes naturally. So bear with me. My title of the lecture today is Government, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I was into Clint Eastwood when I wrote the paper that was presented at the Association of Private Enterprise Education Conference a number of years back. And I submitted that paper to the journal, and it was accepted for publication there. As a matter of fact, they even awarded me the best paper of the year for that particular article. And so I thought I'd stick with themes. You know, the next year I wrote a paper, Economic Growth, What's Love Got to Do with It? Now, they did publish the paper, but I didn't follow up with another award winner. I think they must have preferred Clint Eastwood to Tina Turner, so. And I guess I do too, but I thought it was a catchy title. Anyway, let's get into it. Government, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I chose the title because I wanted to talk about, well, what is good government? What's bad government, and then what's ugly government look like? And so I'll start out with good government. Well, what is good government? And I quote here from Scripture, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. Now think about that. Self-control, that last one, self-control. Good government is self-government before our God. And if we were all just what we should be, if we all submitted ourselves in humble reliance upon our God and did all that we should do by bearing His image on a daily basis in every way, in every facet, of what purpose would the institution we call the state be? So it would have no purpose. Because we would all readily submit to whatever authority structures were legitimate over us, and no one in authority would ever abuse their positions of power. And so life would actually be and go forth as a paradise on earth. That's true. Well, you and I know we don't live there, do we? We live in a different place. Well, self-control, I just want to press this a little bit. Self-control and the concept of natural law, I think, comes into play because what self-control does is it has us respecting the lives of others. We would respect each other in a particular way. We'd never go out and harm someone else by our actions because of our respect for the lives of everyone else. Moreover, we would respect the freedom of choice of everyone else, of all other people. Why? Because we're created in God's image. And being created in God's image, you know, when Moses wrote those words, they had a particular power to them. Now, we think about it, and I was informed of this recently at a conference this past summer by Richard Pratt. And his messages were really right on target. And what he said, and I hadn't really thought about before, was when Moses chose those words, image of God, he was saying something beyond what we typically think of. And while we do bear God's image in the fact that we're rational and we have minds and we're spiritual beings and so forth, when Moses was writing those words, he was writing words that were not unfamiliar to the people around. Because the concept of bearing the image of God was one that was held by people everywhere. However, they assumed that concept, the one who bore the image of God, was only a particular person, namely the Pharaoh or the king, who bore the image of God and then was in touch with God and was bringing God's kingdom to earth. And so when Moses says, you bear the image of God, think about what he's saying there, that every one of us bears the image of God, that we're all to be about being kingdom builders in the here and the now. And by practicing self-government in submission to God's commandments on a daily basis. And so if we're all to do that, then one of the things that would be important is for me to respect the freedom of choice of other people. Why? Because they bear the image of God. And for me to try to go and with a stick and hit somebody over the head and say, you must do what I want you to do, rather than bearing the image of God, would be an abuse of power, an abuse of my situation, an abuse of others. Likewise, we're to respect the property of others. God has put us in a physical creation. He's made us body creatures as well as spiritual creatures. And because we're body creatures and we live by producing property, that's what we do. We encounter the world, the creation is out there, and we come into it. But to live our lives out, we produce property. And it's as simple as this. If I was hungry and I find a berry bush and I go pick the berries off the bush, whose berries are they? Well, they're mine. And if somebody else picks the berries off the bush, whose berries are they? Well, they're theirs. Now, why would I be justified then in taking a stick and beating somebody over the head and clubbing them and then taking their berries, which is what we're prone to do, and it's called theft. But so the concept of self-control in Scripture is very well rooted into the concept of natural law, and we're going to press that a little further as we go along. All right, well, that brings us to what I refer to as bad government. The title might not be quite accurate, but because of our failure to live righteously before God, this has resulted in our need for the institution called the state. And I quote here from Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 4. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He's God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So there's a very important purpose here for the state. Because we're not what we should be, the institution we call the state becomes a necessary institution to protect against gross violations of individual people. Because we fail to keep God's commandments, we fail to bear God's image in 100% form, then what we do is that second half of the 10 Commandments, we tend, with respect to one another, we tend to violate regularly. And so there's this need then to protect people from and to punish those who would murder others. There's a need to punish those who would steal, who would club people over the head and take their private property. There's a need to punish those who would commit fraud and who would go out and lie and cheat. There's a need for that. And if we're going to have any sort of order in society, then the need for the state becomes necessary. Now, it would be nice if we didn't need one. We don't live in that world, so we do need one. But that's the role that becomes the role of government, is to punish wrongdoers. And if you think about it, that connects the natural law conception of the purpose of government up immediately, as John Locke wanted to point out in his 2 treatises on government, that the role of government, the purpose of government, is to protect life, liberty, and property. And that's its essential purpose in society. Now, this brings up the question, has God given governmental rulers a blank check? Is it a blank check? They can do whatever they will. I would say that's not what Paul is suggesting here in Romans chapter 13. After all, if Paul had been willing to submit to governing rulers at every point, there would have been no need for him to have been executed by the governors. He was not willing to submit when it came to the denial of God and God's sovereign rule. And he was saying that the governors had overstepped their bounds at that point. Now, I quote here from Psalm 2 through 4. It says, "The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. The Lord shall hold them in derision." In other words, the concept here is that rulers think that, well, I can go beyond what God's commanded. I can do what I will, and I can be God's vicar on earth, even if I'm violating all his laws. And what God's saying is that's not so. If you rulers do that, if you take counsel, if you try to cast away my rule and my authority over you, I'll hold you in derision. And I'll laugh at you. And you will reap the rewards that you are sowing for yourself. And it won't go so well for you. My example here is the example of Belshazzar and his feast. You know the story. He is having a grand celebration in his palace. He's invited all his noble guests. And they're partying and enjoying themselves immensely. And he says, go get those goblets out of the storage shed that we took out of the temple from in Jerusalem. Let's celebrate with those. We'll toast to our gods out of those. And so they bring them in. They fill them up and they toast. And then all of a sudden, as their celebration continues, the hand appears and begins to write on the wall these words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And of course, what does it mean? Daniel's brought in to interpret. God's weighed you in the balance and he's found you wanting. And this very night, your power's being taken away. And that night, the Medes and the Persians invaded and the Babylonian Empire came to an end. It was over. In time, God sets up rulers and he removes them. And no one can thwart God. No one can set aside his commandments and do what they will with power. Well, we live in a world now where the naturalist assumption, and especially in Western societies, has overwhelmed the academy as well as our societies themselves. And the naturalist assumption, as C.S. Lewis observed, is this one. Lewis, in his book Miracles, writes, "For the naturalist, nature is the whole show, And the ultimate fact, it's the thing you can't go behind. It's a vast process in space and time which is going on of its own accord. Now, naturalism has had profound effects upon the way in which we study various disciplines, and this has led us down many blind alleys. And it is ripping the university apart because, in fact, we can scarcely call them universities anymore. The whole idea of a university is the idea, I mean, think of the word, uni, one. Versity, a diverse study of creation. Economics, psychology, biology, chemistry, physics, history. In other words, out of the many studies, one single body of knowledge. One single body of knowledge. Well, scarcely is that so anymore on the university campuses that I see around. On my own, we might as well, you know, we don't have university in our title, but if we did, we might as well call it the Birmingham Southern Diversity. Because there's no unifying point in the study anymore. And that's what's happened on many campuses. I take this slide from, I've adapted it from a book, Unshakable Foundations by Norman Geisler and Peter Pacino. And I think the book is, if I was going to recommend a book to you, this is an excellent book to read. They do a yeoman's work here of concisely walking us through why worldview matters and what worldview implications are. And they boil it down. They talk about a number of different worldviews, but they kind of focus on three that are prominent in the West. And the three that are prominent in the West are atheism, pantheism, and theism. Atheism is the worldview of most universities today and of most disciplines. The way in which most disciplines are conceived of and the way they're taught are from this atheistic perspective, which is the one of naturalism, that the whole creation is just nature is all there is, and it's going on of its own accord, and we can describe everything without remainder in cause and effect relationships. And there's no openness to it. And so atheism is kind of that the worldview behind the modern day academy. Now, some will try to smuggle God back in by embracing some form of pantheism. And pantheism, of course, is the notion that God is everything. And that, you know, this is the Shirley MacLaine sort of stuff. Or it's also, you see it in movies like Star Wars, you know, Fill the Force, Luke. And that sort of thing, where God is everything. And then theism has been pushed more and more to the side. And so think about the implications here. Let's walk them through these. At the level of God, of course, atheism, God does not exist. Pantheism exists, but unknown. In fact, you know, the whole notion is almost Greek philosophy, that the ultimate being is spiritual. You know, this is sort of the Plato and Aristotle notions, and that everything else emanates from the ultimate source, the Logos. Now think of what John did there when he begins his gospel, speaking of the Logos. What he's doing is he's taking that Greek term and he's filling it up with a person. Jesus. So Jesus is the Logos. And it's a very important thing that he's doing there. Because what that does is it changes pantheism into theism, that God exists and God is knowable in a very different way. Now, As far as the cosmos is concerned, atheists or naturalists assume that it's just always been there. It's always been there. You know, Carl Sagan, billions and billions and billions of years, you know, and it's just always been out there. For the pantheist, the material world is merely an illusion. You know, it's not really real. But for us, for theists, it's a created order. It's really there. Truth, for the naturalist, truth is relative. It's internal because it really, at the end of the day, it's impossible if we are just mechanical beings, determined beings, then we can't know anything. And so we create whatever knowledge we want out of thin air just for whatever happens to suit our fancy at the moment, but nothing is ultimately true. And so it's just a relative sort of thing. And by the way, the pantheists have the same basic viewpoint. Since creation's nothing but an illusion, truth is purely relative as well. But for us, truth is absolute. It comes forth from God Himself. He's the truth. He's the way, He's the life. In terms of evil, for the naturalist, evil is merely human ignorance. You know, there's just ignorance out there, and if we can overcome the ignorance, we'll overcome the evil. For the pantheist, evil is not real. There's no such thing. There's just the yin and the yang of things, and it all kind of works out in the end. For theist, evil is a matter of sin, the sinful heart. In terms of the law, for atheists, for naturalists, the law is of human origin. And once again, this one's shared by the pantheism. The law is of human origin. When Joe Biden speaks of the rule of law or of natural law, all he means by that is this. Well, it's whatever we've decided it is. Or whatever a non-member judge panel has determined it to be. There's no fixed point upon which action is to be taken. However, for us, the law is absolute, and it is articulated by God Himself in His character. And it is incumbent upon us to carry it out, to live by it, to live out that in a real way. In terms of ethics, for the atheist, ethics are purely situational. For the pantheist, once again, just purely relative. But for us, ethics are absolute. Ethics are an absolute fact. This brings us back to the social sciences. Let's go through an illustration from the social sciences. As naturalism has spread throughout Western civilization, it's been a profound change in the way that people view the law. Now, this has resulted in a rapid expansion of the size and power of governments in our world and how they impact our daily lives. Because as we've moved away from a natural law conception of the purpose of government to a naturalist perspective and embraced legal positivism, we've seen a rapid expansion in the size and scope and power of government. And this is going to be quite detrimental to us as time goes on. And I'll try to show some of this. Well, the secular view, I think, is expressed well. This is another excellent book. Nancy Pearcey has written a book titled Total Truth and kind of adapted this from her book. And she says this: according to the positivist view, the law should be based upon the practical consequences that result from them. Oliver Wendell Holmes took the idea that the criterion for the law is social utility, as measured by the social sciences. In his words, the law should be established upon accurately measured social desires. This is the source of one of Holmes' famous aphorisms: "The man of the future is the man of statistics and the master of economics. Law is reduced to a tool for social engineering. The justification for any given law," Holmes wrote, "is not that it represents," and that I have some mistypo here, "an eternal principle such as justice, but that it helps bring out a social end which we desire." That's an affront to God. Holmes is, his position here is an affront to God. He's set himself up, he's sided with the rulers of this world, as Psalm 2 says, against God Almighty. I would not want to be in the man's shoes today, because I think he has discovered the King of Kings, and that we are not a law unto ourselves, that becoming a law unto ourselves is a position that will put us in a very dangerous place. Well, I have this slide, the naturalist view of the state. This has been coming slowly. This is not something that in America it was born yesterday. But this dates back to the 19th century, and in the Enlightenment writers in the 19th century, some of these ideas actually began in the 18th century with a number of writers then. They flowed among an intellectual elite who more and more embraced this naturalist view and began to try to articulate it in their philosophies. And we see this. I've got a couple of, ooh, there we go, that's okay. I have this quote from Hegel, and this ought to scare us. "The universal is to be found in the state. The state is the divine idea as it exists on earth. We must therefore worship the state as the manifestation of the divine on earth." You know, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that this is where most of our neighbors live. They have bowed down at the altar. If they need something, where do they go? They want health insurance. Who do they look to? They want education. Where are they running to? You know, President-elect, what are you going to do for me? If I need a financial bailout because my business isn't going so well, where do I go? This is idolatry. At the root of it, this is idolatry, is what it amounts to. And Hegel was presenting it as an idea, and now it's a principle of action in our society today. This is how far we've come. E.H. Carr, the British historian, made this comment: "A realist makes morality a function of politics and cannot logically accept any standard of value save that fact." Whoa. Well, they expressed well the naturalist, the atheist view. Those are just a couple of quotes that express, I think, quite well. A Christian view of the state is quite different. The Apostle Paul wrote in Romans, I'll just remind you of this, that the purpose of the state is to punish wrongdoers. That's the purpose, is to punish wrongdoers. John Adams, one of our founders, made this statement: "Power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond comprehension of the weak, and that it is doing God's service when it is violating all His laws." I think that's a great quote. And it gets right to the heart of the issue. See, our founders understood something. They understood that power could easily be abused and was abused. Why? Well, do people cease to be sinners when they become public officials? Does that happen? And of course the answer is no. And if the purpose of the state is to limit abuse of power and to protect people, what's to prevent political officials from using power to violate the rights of people instead of protecting the rights of people? So there's a catch-22 in here. While government is necessary, because why? There's bad government. Government's necessary because of bad government. The power of government can easily be abused, and when it is abused, what are we going to get? We're going to get ugly government. That's what we're going to get. We're going to get ugly government. And it is going to do all sorts of things that amount to despotism and tyranny. Well, Herbert Schlossberg, in his book, Idols for Destruction, made this comment. I think it's quite a good one. When the provision of paternal security replaces the provision of justice as the function of the state stops providing justice. Think about that for a moment. When the provision of paternal security replaces the provision of justice as the function of the state stops providing justice. In other words, the state will cease to protect life, liberty, and property because it will be more and more aimed at abusing and violating life, liberty, and property. See, you cannot protect private property and redistribute it at the same time. Those two are worlds apart. If I'm redistributing private property, then I'm forcibly taking it from somebody to give to somebody else. And the state has absolutely nothing to give away that it first didn't take from somebody else. When, if our government votes to bail out the auto industry the way it did the finance industry, it will take our private property from us to give to certain people. That's what it will do. Let's just be upfront about it. And because it has no resources of its own. And our political officials have forgotten this. Grover Cleveland was well known for vetoing progressive legislation. And after he'd vetoed another one of these particular acts that was going to redistribute private property, he was asked about it. He was saying, you're going against the will of the people. And he said, well, I'll quit vetoing this legislation when somebody answers this question for me. If government is to provide for the people, who's to provide for the government? See, the whole point is the government is impotent. It is not in God incarnate. It cannot bring something into being from nothing. And when public officials say that that's what they're going to do, they're lying. And they're coveting God's sovereign role in the universe. And they're violating commandment number 1 of the 10, as well as a few others. They simply are incapable of doing this. It's not a possibility. We live in a world where we utilize economic goods to achieve our ends. We're all purposeful creatures. Part of being created in God's image is that we do have purposes. Now, our purposes are not always the best. We do not always align ourselves up with God. And part of living out our lives, though, I think, is coming to grips with the fact that we'll never really achieve satisfaction and fulfillment in life until our purposes line up with God's purposes for us. But that is a That's a matter of experience. And I don't know about you, but as a sinner, I often live in the school of hard knocks. It would be good if I learned by authority, right? If I submitted myself to the authority of the Scriptures. It would always be far better for me, but I don't know, I'm like you, I'm hard-headed. And in my stubborn hard-headedness and sinful disposition, I end up pursuing my own purposes, often to my detriment. And it's in my failure that God gets my attention. That's how He does it oftentimes. But nevertheless, we use economic means or goods to accomplish our ends. And these economic goods are always scarce relative to the ends. Now, we've had a number of writers who call themselves economists who try to deny this sort of thing from time to time, but the denial is always forced and superficial. I can think of writers like John Kenneth Galbraith or Thorstein Veblen and their dependence effect. But really, it's a non sequitur because, you know, we're creative beings. And the whole idea that, you know, we can have too much of things is really nonsense. Because God's called us to bear His image, to go out in the world, to subdue the world, to take dominion over, to turn it into a garden. That's our role. That's the command. It hadn't changed. And that's what we're to be about. And the way in which we do that is we create property. And we create means to achieving the ends. And so that's what we're doing. Now, there are really only 4 ways that we can ever get what we want in order to achieve our ends. First way, and I did this in the lecture yesterday for the students, so if there are a few students here who are at that lecture, this is a review. The first way to get what you want is to produce it yourself from nothing. Now, I had breakfast this morning. I trust that you did too. Let's see, I had a couple of eggs, and I had an English muffin. Now, let's see, eggs, I guess those come from chickens mainly, but it could come from another bird. And they were fried. So think about this for a moment. If I wanted fried eggs, what would I have to do? Well, first I got to go chase down a chicken somewhere, right? Or find some eggs laying around somewhere that I could appropriate for myself. Now, from that point, if I wanted them fried, what am I going to? I've got to have a pan, right? And I've got to have fire. You know, good grief. How long is it going to take me to make fire? How many of y'all saw the movie Castaway? You know, Tom Hanks trying to create fire, and then when he finally got the fire going, it was celebration time. Think about how difficult it would be for any of us to produce even something as simple as fried eggs and an English muffin. How many hours of labor I would have to engage in to be able to have that meal. I would starve to death before I would eat. Long before I'd eat, I'd starve. However, I'm just guessing, but you can get fried eggs and English muffin for what, $4 in a restaurant? Now I know my wage rate, and so for me that's about half an hour's worth of labor. But even at that, think about how much better off I am than having to go it on my own. which kind of brings me to the second way that we get what I want. Most of the time, the way in which we get what we want is this way. We trade for it. We trade for it. We go out and produce something, and then we use the resources that are produced there, and we use that to trade for what we want. And it makes us so much better off than we would ever live otherwise. And it connects us up. I mean, think about this. This is how communities are built, the economic aspect of how communities are built. This whole aspect of production and trade, because we're all different. I have 2 children. I was telling Bill and some of the others the other night. Their personalities are radically different. And what one of them is going to be good at doing, the other one would just fail miserably. My son's pretty good at mathematics. He can visualize it. My daughter can endure it. Well, that's fine. The world needs both. The world needs both. And there are so many opportunities for us to engage in those things that we're really talented for, that God's gifted us to do, and then to enter into various sorts of exchanges and trades with one another that are mutually beneficial. And we're to do that not just in the economic system, we're to do that in the church, because the same thing is true in the church. When you come to Christ, you're given certain gifts, certain spiritual gifts. And if you utilize your spiritual gifts, you will edify the church body by the use of those gifts. There are many parallels there that I think we miss out on. But so trade is an important way to get what we want. Well, what's another way? Steal it. Yeah, first labor-saving device. Just steal it from somebody else. Take it from someone else by force or fraud. Break out the club. Let's go after somebody. Give it to me. Put that one up there. There's only one other one. Can anyone guess what it is? Be given it. If somebody else gives it to you. Charity. So you could receive it as a gift. We could have charity here. But really, this is all there is. Now, a lot of times the students will want to go, well, how about buy it? And I say, well, you don't understand. Money is just a medium of exchange, a medium of trade. In other words, I exchange my labor services under contract with Birmingham Southern College to teach courses there, and they pay me in money, which I've noticed that grocery stores are quite willing to take in exchange for food. Well, I like that, because I think if I had to go barter for it, I might be in a difficult situation. If I go into the local public store and go to the manager of the store and say, I'll gladly lecture you on economics today. That might be a hard sell. So I'm very thankful for money and the medium of exchange that it brings us. But buying it is still nothing but an indirect means of trade. Now, among these, only 2 are economic, the other 2 are not economic. The 2 that are economic are production and trade. The other 2 are not economic because they cannot be generalized. The logic of the thief only works for the thief. It cannot work for the general mass. In other words, it suffers the fallacy of composition. I did this with the students. Let's suppose y'all are all busy out working, and I'd say to myself, well, work, I don't really like work. Thorns and thistles, sweat on my brow, all that, that's not for me. And I like to sleep in, 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. That's when I usually like to get up. And I've noticed that all of you good people, you're out working, producing stuff. And so I've discovered I can find what I need because you leave your homes unattended. And if I just go over and I kind of let myself in and look around, I can walk away with all that's needed for my daily provisions. So I go to one of your houses and I say, oh, you've got a new big screen TV. I like that, high def. Yeah, I could use that. Somebody else has some nice filet mignon in their refrigerator. Oh, that sounds good. That'll be for dinner tonight. And, next house, oh, there's a nice bottle of Bordeaux. Well, that will go well with the steaks. Okay, so now I'm well on my way to dinner. And I like to get home in the afternoon because, I might like to catch Oprah and Dr. Phil in the afternoon and then grill those steaks. And the most work that I did all day was hauling that big screen TV out to the truck, which I repossessed from one of you. Now, it works for me, but it doesn't work for you. As a matter of fact, think of it for a moment. If everyone tried to live this way, we would all starve to death because there would be no big screen TVs, there would be no filet mignon, there would be no Bordeaux. There would be nothing to steal because there was nothing produced. It won't work. Likewise, charity, as much as we value charity, there's a prerequisite to all charity, and that is production. You cannot give away that which you do not possess. And if you'll follow Paul's reasoning in Ephesians, you'll see that. In Ephesians 4:28, he says, "Let him who is stealing steal no longer, but do something useful with his own hands, that he will have something to share with those in need." So progression there. Stealing, stop that. Go do something productive. Don't consume it all. And then you'll have something to share with those in need. You got to produce something before you can give anything away. Our greatest example, of course, is Christ. And our celebration this Christmas season, the Incarnation, is a celebration of the fact that Jesus was willing to leave the throne room to take on the human body and live the life of perfect submission that you and I are incapable of because of our sinful nature. He earned your salvation. He earned it. And so when he goes to the cross and he accepts your sin on the cross, he did it on a voluntary basis for you. And we can celebrate that at this season. And I hope we all do celebrate it in a real way. But if we're all sitting around like birds in a nest, with our mouths open, waiting for somebody to come and drop something in, we'll all starve to death. Because charity requires production as a prerequisite to it. Well, we've been embracing ugly government for some time now. I write this comment here because I think this is really true. There's an overriding presumption in the modern mind that private individuals who oppose collectivism are only doing so because they are selfish and immoral. Accordingly, in the modern idolatry of statism, the compromise of personal values is the only way to get along. Anyone who refuses to compromise his values to the general will is viewed as an enemy. I often have people, when I'm taking my position, saying, "Don't you care about people? Don't you care about the poor?" Well, of course I care about the poor. This is why I want principles, because I do care about the poor. They're getting run over in the street. I don't know if you know that. We have a Bible club called Discovery Clubs for elementary school children in the inner cities in Birmingham. And my son and I participated in that club last year and in leading the third grade boys at one of the inner city schools. And it was just sad to see the conditions. But they're getting exactly what state education will bring you. An inferior product where if they learn to read, it will be a miracle. It'll be a miracle because that's not what these schools are set up to do. It's not the purpose. The purpose is indoctrination. Always has been the purpose, always will be the purpose. You know, a lot of people think that our educational system is failing. I don't think it's failing at all. I think it's succeeding beyond the wildest dreams of its creators, of its real purpose, which is indoctrination. One thing I can be sure of among my students is they will have been indoctrinated into the newest religion that is propagated daily in our school system, which is environmentalism. They will all come, they'll be socialist and environmentalist. They'll hold those views very tightly. And it takes time to, pry the hands loose from that and to challenge that. Because really what's behind environmentalists, the hardcore ecologists, are also evolutionists and naturalists. And they think that the problem is us because we bear God's image, and they're trying to root it out. That's their solution to the problems we face in this world. That's curing the headache by decapitation. Yeah, you won't have a headache anymore, but you won't exist. And if you dig deep in some of their websites, you'll find that's out exactly what they intend. I was on one and dug back beyond the opening pages with the pictures of the cuddly furry animals and found their real agenda, which is to reduce the world's population down to about 100,000, I think. Maybe it was 100 million. Well, 100 million, I guess that means 5.9 billion of us have to go. I guess that makes Hitler pretty much the saint in that sense. And if you think about it, this agenda makes really no sense whatsoever. Because, they talk about animal rights. Animals don't have rights. They don't respect rights. Any theory of rights has to have creatures capable of acknowledging rights. And by creation, animals don't bear God's image. They're not like us in that way. They're not moral creatures. Talk about my dog, Buddy. Buddy's not moral. Huh? He's a dog. He's not sitting out in his doghouse trying, going, gee, I wonder what I'll do today. Maybe I'll theorize about what my purpose in life is. And, it might be nice to have an air-conditioned doghouse. Maybe I can discover the theory behind air conditioning and put that in. It's not occurring to him, I don't believe. Or at least he's shown no signs of it. And oftentimes when reality comes face to face with the environmentalists, I don't know, it doesn't jog them into reality somehow. There was a story of the Exxon Valdez after the accident there. They fished out all sorts of animals. And a couple of them that they fished out were a couple of sea lions. And so they cleaned these sea lions up, even named them, Molly and Dolly. Spent a lot of money nursing these sea lions back to health. Molly and Dolly. And the day finally came, they're going to take them back and release them back into the wild. So they went down to the water side, and they had them in the cages. They opened the cages, and the group there held hands and sang. It was a real kumbaya moment. And the sea lions ventured out of their cages and slipped into the water and began to swim out. And about that time, a pack of killer whales ventured on the scene. Now, I don't know if you know about killer whales, but they feed on sea lions. And they ate Molly and Dolly. And I don't know if you've seen this. There was a nice show about this on the Discovery Channel, about how killer whales feed on sea lions. It's not like just you come up in one bite and rip them apart and that's it. No, they like to tenderize their food first. And so a killer whale will come and grab a sea lion up by the tail and then come out of the water and just whack it down across the top of the water and go back and forth, just whacking it senseless. And then throw it up in the air, dive down, and bat it like a baseball with its tail. And the sea lion will be just flopping through the air and skipping across the water. And another killer whale will come up and do exactly the same thing. And they'll do this for like 30 minutes. And then they'll rip it to shreds and get them all a little piece. They had to be horrified. I mean, you know, here their whole worldview is coming unraveled right before their eyes. I'm not sure, though, they got it. I wish they would. Well, here's what's happened. We've been on a binge here. The U.S. has never been ideal. Our founders stated principles very well. It's in all of our founding documents, this commitment to the natural law. Now, while it was stated well in principle, it was never carried out perfectly in practice. The two most glaring errors at the beginning were slavery and tariffs, protectionist tariffs. Slavery is obvious. Slavery is the situation where we're robbing somebody of their individual freedom to produce for themselves. And that's something you can't do if you're going to affirm the natural law. But tariffs, protectionist tariffs, are equally an abuse of private property and of liberty, because you are, for the benefit of a special interest, you're imposing restrictions on the actions of others. And so protectionist tariffs were always an abuse as well. And so the Hamiltonians, who were trying to promote these things, were actually advocating an older mercantilism that was being rebelled against. I mean, the founders were saying no, that governments, when they overstep their bounds, when the king oversteps his bounds, you can say no. That's what they were saying. That's what the Declaration of Independence says. And so while Hamilton, he didn't get this one, and he's wanting to reinstitute a violation of the natural law. And so there's these two issues. There's kind of this ongoing battle between these two issues in the early years of the Republic. I would add to that there was a third issue of money, because we never really had free market banking either. Now, the Civil War brought to a head the conflict. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we had the two sides. I don't say unfortunately, because in the two sides we had the South totally wrong on the slave issue, totally correct on the tariff issue. Then we had the North totally wrong on the tariff issue, totally correct on the slave issue. And here we have warfare. Now, we know who won, so what are we left with? Well, we're left with a government that's going to start growing and serving the special interest of the few at the expense of the many, through various rules and regulations and hindrances to private exchange and violations of private property. That's what we're going to be left with in time. Now, I show you this because I've got here on this picture, on this slide, this is real government expenditures from 1800 to the year 2000. And when I did the slide, I say current proposal, 3.1 trillion. Well, that's a reality. In fact, it's going to be more than that. I think this year they're projecting, because of all the bailouts, a $1 trillion deficit for the year. But you'll see, from 1800 to 1850, well, government expenditures in 1800. Now, I've adjusted this for inflation. We're $135 million. By 1850, it was $813 million. Well, if we adjust for changes in the size of population, you would see it's really fairly flat. There's not much change. By 1900, it's up to $11.25 billion. Once again, though, adjusting for population size, there really is pretty flat. As a matter of fact, throughout this time period, government expenditures at the federal level were less than 2% of GDP. It's not the same today. By 1950, federal government expenditures had climbed to $318 billion. At the beginning of the Bush presidency, the expenditures were up at $1.8 trillion. As W leaves, it's at $3.1 trillion. Well, with all due respect, George has spent money like a drunken sailor in port for the first time in a year. He said no to almost nothing. And under his term in office, expenditures have climbed by over 50%. That's hardly fiscal conservatism. I can see why the Republicans lost in the most recent election. You can't talk the game and then not play it out. You know, you gotta have backbone there. I went through this. I was given an analogy. I don't think people understand the concept of a trillion. It's a big number, right? $1 trillion. And I use this analogy. I heard this analogy from a colleague a number of years back. Suppose John the Baptist had tired of being God's prophet. You know, eating locusts and honey, wearing animal skins. Just wasn't kind of the lifestyle he'd hoped for. And he had decided that he would rather live the lifestyles of the rich and famous and spent $1 million a day toward that effort. Do you know he'd still be spending money today and would not have gone through $1 trillion yet? It would take 2,730 some odd years to blow through $1 trillion. We're going to run a deficit of $1 trillion this year. I'm sure we don't need to worry about that. How did we get here? Well, one of the big watershed events occurred in 1913. Actually, several big watershed events occurred in this year. One was the 16th Amendment, and which allowed for an income tax. There was a reason our founders didn't want an income tax, because it was so easily used to redistribute private property, which they thought was immoral. And I think they're right. Another event that occurred in that year, though, and I just mentioned this one, was the creation of the Federal Reserve System, which monopolized banking in the U.S. and put us on a crash course, or a crash system, where we're heading for an economy that is forever in a boom-bust cycle. Now, I don't have time today to explain that one, but the current financial fiasco has been orchestrated by our Federal Reserve, and more money is not the way out. Anyway, let's go back to the original income tax. Most people acquiesce to the original income tax in the 16th Amendment merely because they didn't think it affected them. Or if it did affect them, it wouldn't affect them much. I've got here the original 1913 personal income tax schedule. You'll see the rates. The marginal rates run from 1% up to 7%. And the first $3,000 of income for a single individual was exempt. For a married couple, the first $4,000 was exempt. And you'll see the rates. You pay 1% for the first $20,000, and then for the next $30,000, 2%. The next $25,000, 3%, and so forth until you got up to the 7% rate. So that was the schedule. Now, if I adjust that for inflation, look what happens to it. You pay 1% for the first $356,000 in taxable income you earn. And if you were a single individual, you wouldn't pay anything until you made over $53,500 in income. First $53,500 is exempt. If you're married, the first $71,343 were exempt. See, for most people, the income tax didn't apply to them. It was for those rich people out there. It's for the rich people. Heck, you wouldn't even pay the 7% rate unless you made over $9 million in taxable income. You know? Where do the rates begin today? 10%. The lowest rate today is higher than the highest rate in the original plan. It's 10%. And for a single individual, they file with a standard deduction and personal exemption, would have around $8,000 to $9,000 exempt from taxation. That's it. And then you start paying that 10% rate. That's the way this thing is set up today. And then it stair steps up from there up to 35%. And for our new president-elect, that's too low in his estimation. Well. There are hard consequences of income redistribution that we can't get around. The first consequence is it hinders economic progress. Now, I typically play a little game with my students in principles class when I talk about taxation and redistribution. I suggest, now let's suppose that, the first exam, I do this in the first material before our first exam, and the first exam is coming up. And for those of you who are professors in here and who have classes, I don't know if you're like me, but I've noticed I always have a few students who are on my roll sheets, and I refer to them as my unknown student, because while they're on the roll sheet, somehow they can't find the classroom. At least not until test days. And then they kind of show up. Now, I notice they never do too well on exams. And so I always will pick out a student who sits right on the front row every day, takes copious notes, pays attention, asks great questions. So if it's Mary, I'll say, Mary, you're here, you're always here, and you're asking good questions. I can tell you're reading the material, you're thinking about what we're doing in here. My guess is you're going to do pretty well on the test. And they typically do. And so let's just say Mary, she scores a 95 on the exam. And my unknown student, Mr. X, takes the exam and he gets a 50. And I'm sitting in my office and I'm going, oh my. I don't know if I can do this or not, to give Mr. X what he justly deserves. That'd be hard, to give him what he justly deserves here, the 50. I may wreck his life, though. You know, this may be the straw that breaks the camel's back. He may be kicked right on out of this institution. He may end up on the street, and how could I have that on my conscience? And so I'm sitting there, and it occurs to me, well, what do you know? Mary's got points to spare. And, you know, so I sit in my office. I'm just really excited by it. You know, I'm the governor of this classroom. So I'll just take points away from the minority of the better students and give them to the majority of weaker students. And, you know, it'll be great. And so Mary gets her test back, 95 less 10 redistributed points. It's a solid B, Mary, solid B. Mr. X gets his test back with great excitement, 50 plus 20 redistributed points. That's a gentleman's C minus. He's going to make it after all. And then I'll look at Mary and I'll say, now, Mary, you want to tell me anything about my plan? And most of my Marys will say, Mr. Cleveland, I won't be too happy with you. And some will be a little more articulate than that. And I'll say, well, why not? And then I'll go, oh, I know, I forgot. We should have voted on it. Well, I'll tell you what, Mary, we'll have a campaign. We'll give speeches for and against the proposal. And then we'll take a vote. You feel better now, Mary. And she'll go, no. And I'll say, well, why not? And she'll say, well, I'm in the minority. And I'm going to get outvoted. And I'll say, yeah, you're right. See, democracy alone is no guarantee of justice, is it? Democracy alone is, I heard from one writer who said, it's two wolves and one sheep trying to decide what to have for lunch. Wouldn't want to be that sheep. All right, now think of this. The very next question I will ask of Mary is this. Mary, how hard do you intend to work from here on out in this class if this plan is enacted? And she said, Mr. Cleveland, you won't see me again. I'll show up on test days with Mr. X. She's not going to do it. She just won't do it. Why? Because she can't keep the reward that she earned. Justice wasn't served. And so now in economics, it'll show up a little differently. In my classroom, there will be an immediate drop-off in learning because there are only so many points you can earn on an exam. Can't get over 100. I don't give bonus points. In the world of economics, there's no cap to the amount of wealth that can be created. So when we begin to redistribute private property, it won't immediately destroy economic progress. However, it will hinder economic progress because at the margins, the incentives are all the same. At the margins, people will always feel like Mary. I had a buddy of mine who we went to graduate school at Texas A&M together. He teaches at Boise State. And anyway, a few years ago, he'd started doing some consulting on the side. And he was making, good money. I think his fee was $100 an hour. And he was getting business. I thought, oh, that's great, Dwayne. That's good to hear. And well, we chat pretty frequently with one another. And we've worked on a number of writing projects together. And so I hadn't asked him about it for a few years, but we were chatting one day, and I just kind of came across my mind, so I thought I'd ask him how it was going. He said, oh, well, Paul, I've quit that. I said, well, why? He said, well, the work itself had some downsides, was one thing. However, there were other things too. $100 an hour sounds like a lot, but, with the salary I'm pulling at the college, I'm already in a pretty high tax bracket. I think his tax bracket was easily the 28% or maybe even 31% because he's teaching finance. And so that plus the state income tax, I think he has a state income tax in Idaho. That combined brought it up to about 35% or more. Plus then there's self-employment tax. There's another 15.3%. And then I've noticed the government loves for us to fill out paperwork, and they love for businesses to fill out paperwork, usually in triplicate. And they don't pay you to fill out their paperwork. And so he started figuring out the time he was spending filling out paperwork for free, added all that in, and it took that wage rate down from $100 an hour down to about $25. And he said, Paul, it wasn't worth it. And I know Dwayne. Dwayne loves to hunt, fish, snow ski, cross-country ski. He's an outdoors kind of person. And he said, well, Paul, it just wasn't worth it. I live in Idaho. And I can do all the things I love to do. I punted. And now I have more time to do the things I love to do. People don't do that which doesn't achieve the end. Other things equal, I think you might have liked to have had the extra income, but they weren't equal. So he punted. Well, a lot of people are doing that, and that's why it hinders economic progress. Next thing it does, it promotes hatred and discord in society. When you begin to redistribute private property, you intentionally put people into special interest groups, and you pit them against one another in the political setting. And what happens is elections become dirty and nasty. People think they're nasty now. I don't think we've seen anything yet. I think we're just on the tip of the iceberg there. Because everybody's trying to gore everybody else's goat or keep their goat from getting gored. That's what's going on. I often will ask my Mary at this point, Mary, Mr. X, he was the most outspoken proponent for my redistribution plan when we put it up for a vote. You probably want to date him, I bet. Right? No, I don't believe so there, Mr. Cleveland. I think I'll decline that invitation. You see, that separates people. That does not build community, it destroys community. I live in my colleagues, comrades, colleagues, at Birmingham Southern who are all in favor of various forms of redistribution want to talk about building community. And they say, well, we need a symphony. It builds community. We need an art museum. It builds community. And I said, no, it doesn't build community. We don't need taxpayer dollars to fund those things. After all, I'll give you, to make the illustration sound, among the communities in suburb of Birmingham, we have Mountain Brook. Mountain Brook is the wealthiest community. We also have Hueytown. Hueytown is where all our stock car drivers come from. Davy Allison, and so forth. And I said, to force the guy who lives in Hueytown to pay taxes to fund the art museum, and his idea of high culture is a six-pack of Budweiser and the truck and tractor pull on ESPN, I think is a little disingenuous. What you're really talking about here is Mountain Brook welfare. Because he's never going to grace the doors of that art museum. And the people who will enjoy it can darn well afford to pay the entrance fee. It doesn't build community. It pits people against one another. You know, but when you're at my college is the aristocratic elite, you know. So when you're a member of the aristocratic elite, all this stuff makes sense, right? Now, the last consequence of forced redistribution of private property is it destroys freedom. This destroys freedom itself. The best illustration I've heard to drive this point home was actually an essay I read that was written by a man named McDaniel. And Mr. McDaniel grew up in the early part of the 20th century. In 1905, his father, when he was a young boy, took him to a barbecue on the banks of the Ocmulgee River in Georgia. Now, this is rural Georgia, 1905. Now, what was the occasion? The occasion was their congressman was invited to give a speech and tell his constituents why he would not vote for a farm subsidy bill. Now, they're all farmers. This is rural Georgia, 1905. Everybody's a farmer. Everybody's making their living in agriculture. And so they all cared about this. Why aren't you going to do something for us? And so they came out that day. So the congressman got up to speak. Well, instead of speaking directly to the subject, he told them a story. This is kind of the Southern way, if you like it. I like, you know, Southerners love stories, you know, and I like them too because Jesus told so many stories. Anyway, here's the story he told. He got up and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, just a few miles down this river, there's a bend in the river. And at that bend, there's a thicket. And at one time, there were a pack of wild hogs who used to live out in that thicket. And nobody knew where those hogs had come from, how they got to be there, or how they survived out there. But they lived through every sort of natural disaster you can imagine. Fires, freezes, floods, droughts, you name it, they survived. In fact, they were such wiry little creatures that it would make local news if a hunter were actually able to shoot one. Well, one day a man rode into the local town, went into the general store owner there, and was asking for directions to the whereabouts of these hogs and to this thicket. So the store owner gave the man directions, and the man just walked back out, got in his wagon, and rode out. And the store owner really didn't think too much about it. Well, about 6 months later, the man came back to the store owner and he said, "Sir, I was wondering if maybe I could hire your services and maybe you know some other people here who would like to make a little money. And I've got all these hogs in a pen out by the river and I want to bring them into market and I'll need some help." And so the store owner was like, "Well, I can't believe you were able to catch all those hogs." And he said, "Well, you're welcome to come see." And so word spread through the community and everybody had to go out and see this thing. And so they all got out there and sure enough, this man had a big pen built and he had all these hogs in that pen. And they were amazed. They said, "How are you able to do this? This is an impossibility. Nobody could have caught all these hogs." And the man said, "Well, actually, it's pretty easy. The first thing I did when I got out here is I threw out a couple of ears of corn. And those hogs wouldn't go near that corn for the first 3 weeks. But finally, a couple of the young ones ran out of the bush, grabbed a couple of ears, and then beat back off into the thicket. So I just kept putting corn out every day, and pretty soon they were all eating it. And that's when I started to build the pen. And I built it a little higher and a little further around that corn every day. And when I'd finally noticed they quit foraging for roots and berries and such, I put a trap door on that pen so they all could get into that corn but couldn't get back out. So I can trap any animal on the face of this earth if he'll just depend on me for a free handout." Bingo. I think the people of that day got the message. That subsidy, the cost of that subsidy was their freedom. They were giving it up. And the congressman made his point quite well. This is a fairly long quote, but I think it's worthwhile. This is from one of my heroes of the faith, J. Gresham Machen. And he says this: "The whole development of modern society has tended mightily toward the limitation of the realm of freedom for the individual man. It never seems to occur to the modern legislatures that although welfare is good, forced welfare may be bad. In other words, utilitarianism is being carried out to its logical conclusions. In the interest of physical well-being, the great principles of liberty are being thrown ruthlessly to the winds. The result is an unparalleled impoverishment of human life. Personality can only be developed in the realm of individual choice, and that realm in the modern state is being slowly but steadily contracted. The truth is that the materialistic paternalism of the present day, if allowed to go unchecked, will rapidly make of America one huge main street where spiritual adventure will be discouraged and democracy will be regarded as consisting in the reduction of all mankind to the proportions of the narrowest and least gifted of the citizens." Machen wrote this in 1934, was the publication date on this book. And I highly recommend it. The title of the book is Christianity and Liberalism, because we're realizing his prediction. In modern-day America today, we're realizing his prediction. Well, this is, I've launched Boundary Stone, and I'm in the process of actually trying to create Boundary Stone Ministries as a non-profit to fund more efforts of getting out and doing lectures and that sort of thing. And my purpose behind Boundary Stone is to bring economics and Western civilization resources to equip and encourage Christians to engage our culture and influence it for Christ. Because if we don't get this message right and we don't begin to start acting as if we understand it, then all is lost. I was reading this morning, we were at dinner last night, that question came up, where do we go from here? Is there hope? There is hope. There is hope. I was reading this morning in 1 John. In fact, there's not only hope, there's victory ahead. I'm here to encourage you today. There's victory ahead. Because here's what John says. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. And with those words, and I think about what that carries, because that carries with it, we believe His Word. And we take it on His authority, and we act upon it, and we begin to challenge the assumptions of our day, the naturalist assumptions of our day, not just, in terms of trying to share a simple gospel message to get conversion, but to make disciples, which means taking captive every thought, bringing our disciplines, every one of our diverse disciplines, back to being rooted in a consistent Christian worldview. And there's a lot of work to be done there if that's going to happen in our age. We've mentioned a couple of my books. I've got my slides here. These are the two books I've finished. The first is Understanding the Modern Culture Wars. I wrote this initially for students, high school students, as well as I thought it could be a companion text in college level for those colleges still teaching Western civilization. I've tried to paint with broad brushstrokes, but give a Christian background to this. And then my newest book, which we just got the proofs on, is coming out before the end of the year, Unmasking the Sacred Lies. And what I do in this book is I go through and look at the economic policy as it's been developed in American history over time, and where we've strayed and what the consequences have been. So those are the two I'm working on. I've got plans for future books to help communicate some of these ideas. And I do have, I'll shamelessly promote myself here, if you were interested at all in those books, I do have some flyers, and I actually will offer them at discounted. They'll be offered at discounted prices. So. I'll open it up for a question. Do we have a few minutes here and do Q&A? Yes.
First, Dr. Cleveland, thank you for your words. I think we could probably get a collective amen from this group, and certainly a prayer that your words would continue to get louder. My question for you is this. In your reference and story about the pigs was so great, so visually easy to see. There probably are some pigs still outside the pen, except being one of those, I get entrapped in seeing it as very futile to help those pigs that continue to want to stay in the pen. I once heard a quote that says, you know, it's not as hard to get new ideas into someone's mind as it is to get the old ones out. Based on your practice, your speaking, and the learnings that you've had, what would you do to change course from where we are?
You mean in terms of working with the students? I think at first, I think at first we got to communicate the message, right? And it starts with education. I'm afraid that what happened in Christian communities in the latter part of the 19th century is when the naturalists were gaining sway and making inroads into intellectual communities with evolutionary theory and so forth, instead of engaging in the intellectual debate full bore, we had two responses on the parts of some Christians that were not helpful. One response was just dogmatism. We're not going to engage, but we're right because we're right. Well, that doesn't answer the questions. It's not being intellectually honest. The other response was, okay, well, you guys are right. It didn't occur that way, but it's okay with us because the Bible, is only trying to point us in the right direction. And that sparked liberalism. That Machen saw the problems of, in fact, he was forced out of Princeton. He was the last of the group of conservative thinkers at Princeton until he was forced out when it started Westminster. So I think part of it is Christians must re-engage in the intellectual debate. And I think that's beginning to happen. I've worked with a group and been working with them. Campus Crusade launched a faculty ministry back in 1985, and that this has been encouraged. And this is where I first was encouraged to do what I'm doing. Now, it's a hard sell because some of my colleagues, quite frankly, are happy teaching naturalism, even if they're Christians. And I've got to convince them that that's a dead end. So, I mean, that's we're up against a problem there. So, and right now we're still a Gideon's army here. Yeah.
Is there any role for government beyond punishing evildoers? Can government make highways, public parks, national forests?
Well, to the extent that it is engaged in those sorts of activities, it's really not acting as government. Now, it might engage in those kinds of public works projects, but I would suggest that the only way that it could be justified is if the projects themselves are funded by user fees. In other words, because then you haven't left the benefit principle of taxation. So we have those in highways today. So the highway system is not as big of a deal. Why? Well, I voluntarily go gas my car up, and I'm quite willing to pay the gasoline tax, the excise tax on the gasoline. I like to drive, and I'm using the highways. I'm paying for the highways in that way. So I don't have the problem, the justice problem I have that's involved in forced redistribution. Now, we got to be careful here, because one of the problems we face today in transportation is that our central planners are raping, pillaging the highway funds, the highway trust funds, to pay for these light rail systems that are losers economically and will not pay for themselves, and hence are a matter of redistribution. Yes?
Just a question. As you speak across the country, do you see that Christians across the country are aware of a kind of crossroads that we're at, of a road to freedom or road to bondage? Is there an understanding of that?
I think there's an understanding that things are going wrong. That we're at a crossroads, I'm not sure that people understand that. I think what I ask when I speak in a lot of places, if I take a survey, how many of you think we've got problems? Survey says all hands go up. But and some of the problems are obvious to us. You know, the growing immorality of abortion, you know, other things like this, very obvious to us. But I think what people fail to do is they fail to go back to where we began to get off the path, where it looked like the same thing, you know, and where people compromise their principles in the beginning. Because if we're going to get back on track, we've got to go back to the beginning. We've got to understand where we got off the path. You know, people say, well, you can't go back. And I go, well, you know, now, if I'm driving from Birmingham to New York City, but I've got on a highway headed to Florida, the sooner I turn around and drive the other way, the sooner I'll get to New York City. And if I never turn around, I'm going to end up in the Keys, further away from my real destination. If I try to drive beyond that, I guess I'll drown. But does that make sense? In other words, do people understand? I get, there is a sense, all Christians too have been educated in government schools. And even in universities, some of which are called Christian universities, where they think, oh, I've learned something, where the implicit assumption behind what they've learned is naturalism. So what they think they know from an atheist perspective. So in a sense, they're still just practical atheists, even though they may be Christians in spirit. Yes? Did somebody? Yeah.
I believe it was de Tocqueville that came to America and said the government can't stand when the democracy invoke special interests for themselves.
Yeah.
In light of real government payments, expenditures, in terms of interest on the debt, transfer payments, subsidies, where do you think we are in terms of de Tocqueville's prediction?
Pretty far down the road, wouldn't you say? Are we, you know, this question always comes up, are we teetering on the edge of total crash and burn? You know, because I realize that my lecture is somewhat like, well, here's the bad news, guys, you know. And I hate to be just, you know, doom and gloom, because I really, we have all these doomsayers running around. The sky is falling, the sky is falling, global warming. I wish we had a little of that today. And it's not that bad in many respects. And in fact, now we are heading in a bad direction. But even with all the bad things that are happening, think about the economy, though. There's still been room for a great deal of entrepreneurial success in our economy, despite all the rules and regulations and hindrances. After all, a couple of the richest men in America were college dropouts, Bill Gates and Michael Dell. They didn't start with anything except ideas, and they've both built very successful businesses. So it can still be done. In fact, we need people to go do it, to be entrepreneurial, to step out in faith and to utilize their God-given gifts and talents. And so all those things have been very good news. I mean, I think about computer technology. The way I did my dissertation. Now, word processing was just coming into existence at that time, but I didn't have a personal computer, and I didn't have a word processor or know how to use one. And so I wrote out my dissertation by hand and hired a typist. Now, she used a word processor, but she would give me the printed pages back, and I would make corrections, meet with my committee. They would make suggestions for changes. I'd make changes. I'd go back and forth this way. What a cumbersome way to do it. I wouldn't even dream of beginning any writing project that way today. I carry around my little laptop. And, I can just start from there. Heck, it even improves checks my grammar, my spelling ability, all those sorts of things. So in terms of productivity for me, at least tenfold increase that has produced. So, as we become more productive, what that does is it overcomes the detrimental effects of the redistribution. And that's been positive for us. Can that continue forever? There is a tipping point. I don't know where it is. And then, the other thing too, when civilizations die, it usually takes hundreds of years. I mean, you can play the prodigal longer the richer you were to begin, right? Because you got a lot more to squander. So, other questions or yes?
Practical question. It appears as if there will be another stimulus package sent toward us in this room. And let's say that Mr. Obama, once he gets into the presidency, decides that he wants to send each and every taxpayer $1,500. Is your suggestion to accept that $1,500 or to say no thank you?
No, I mean, he's already taken it out of your pocket. Why not? Could take it back? Yeah.
Because that's my very point, that he's already taken out of my pocket.
No, I'm going to cash the check.
He's taking it out of my right pocket and putting it in
my
left pocket, but he had to take out more than $1,500.
Of course he did.
Thank you.
Of course he did. He's destroying wealth.
Yes.
And he's lengthening the hardship. All the policies that have been pursued right now will only serve to lengthen the economic hardship that we face today. Yes?
Is he really taking it out of our right and putting it on our left, or is he taking it out of our grandchild's pocket?
That too. He's taking it out.
I almost feel like we're not paying for what we are getting.
Yeah, every time I explain Social Security to my students, I say, you know, when you see the RV rolling down the highway with that bumper sticker that says, "I'm spending my children's inheritance," take it seriously. Yeah, that is happening. Part of it is we're bearing the cost now and imposing it on our children. And so we've taken that proverb that says a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and we've turned it on its head, and we're saying it this way: a good man squanders the future prosperity of his great-grandchildren to the 4th and 5th generations. So that's what we're doing, yeah. Yes?
So what you're saying is the new little piglets who will be born, in fact, in the crib.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great.
So it is both, and we will pay for some of it right up front, because when they go out and borrow the money, quite a bit of it, they'll put pressure on the Federal Reserve to monetize it with new money. And so it'll just destroy the value of your money, which is why we have to adjust all those numbers. Last question. Yes.
Would you say that a Christian's role in environmentalism or in the environment would be, or would you say that we have a role?
We can't hear you over here.
Sorry. So I said, what would you say?
The Christian's role in environmental, in having a clean environment.
Right.
An affirmation of private property. And the reason is that the issues that arise, that are the true issues of problems, environmental problems, arise because of the commons. Okay? See, we live in a world that is wide open. I mean, our first parents was wide open. Now, if there was a bush, anybody was free to go pick the berries off that bush. But now, if we're all picking berries off that bush, what's going to happen to the amount of berries in the bush? They're going to dwindle, right? So there's going to be conflict because we're not conserving the resource, all right? Now, let's suppose that you say, well, I could wander out further in the woods and find another bush, but I really hate to walk that far. And so you decide a different strategy. So you take clippings from the one bush and you plant your own berry bushes. Now, whose berry bushes are those? Yours. See, what you've done is you've resolved the problem through the creation of property. Okay? And so the resolution to a lot of these environmental issues is the creation of property and the application of natural law thought. So, and in the environmental issues of, say, pollution, we were already marching down that road before we ever embraced legal positivism. People were not just free to dump whatever they liked in the rivers, because they were always, everybody understood, you were always putting yourself at a liability risk if you dumped something nasty in there and that caused somebody else's a problem. And if they could identify you as the source, they could get compensation. So long before an EPA, corporations monitored their discharges into waterways based upon past rulings. And as the economy grows, nobody wants to live in a cesspool. The environment gets better. I don't know if you've traveled very much, but I will guarantee you don't really have to travel to foreign destinations to find this out. You can do it right here in Denver. The poorer the neighborhood, the worse the environment's going to be. The richer the neighborhood, the cleaner it's going to be. See, wealth will get you to a better destination. I was in Chengdu, China in October, and the smog there was pretty thick. Well, what do they need there? They need a little economic advancement. The air quality here is far better. I was in Shanghai a couple of years ago, and same thing is true there. It's a city about the size of New York City, about 20 million people. And the air and water quality in New York far superior to the air and water quality in Shanghai. What's the difference? Economics. What's the difference? Economic prosperity. And so if I'm really interested in a clean environment, clean water, clean air, then the last thing I want to do is listen to what the environmentalists are telling us. Because they're out to destroy private property. And they're being aided and abetted by socialists. Socialism became untenable with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and most of the socialists embraced the environmental movement. We refer to them as watermelons. They're green on the outside, but you cut them open and they're really red on the inside. Okay.